Hello, everybody. My name is Joseph Ayani, and thank you for joining myself and Pavel Kuryagin. We are talking about effective education. I'm going to give you all a very brief introduction about who I am and what I do, but this show is not about me. And if it starts becoming about me, that was an accident, so call the authorities. I'm a media producer and a web content host. I've been doing this for 10 years, and I essentially help people with whatever it is that they're trying to do online, whether it's editing, recording, producing, writing, researching. And in some cases, I roll up my sleeves and get involved in the conversation directly, whether that's a host, co host, or even just like a recurring guest that slowly turns into a host. That last one did happen. Pavel, this is the project brought together by you. And of course, I am thanking you personally for including me on this project. So I think the first place to start is, of course, to tell the people what can we know about you and what inspired you to create this project that we are working on today.
Hi everyone, thanks for watching this pilot episode of the podcast. I want to create content for those of you who want to progress in your web developer career faster. And the thing that inspired me to that, actually, I've been thinking of switching to this educational track all through my career because I had a very positive experience of self-education of my own that was mostly intuitive to me. And I also worked as an employer. I've been an employer and I worked as a developer, as a senior developer. So I saw how other people act, how you approach problems, and I saw those changes that I addressed previously by myself, and that other people do not notice, do not understand, and so they are able to solve tasks slower or even simpler tasks than me. And I also saw the when a developer with 2 years of experience is becoming a tech leader. And he's a really good leader. In the same time, the really smart people could work for 10 years as a middle developer just because they don't believe in themselves or just they do not practice everything that would help them grow. So the purpose of this and my other channels is to work on content and learning materials to spread this knowledge, the ability to self-learn.
Now, self learning is something that I can attest to as well, although not in the tech field. Although web media obviously has a lot of technical backing to it, it's largely known as a creative field. The irony of the creative field is that it's supposed to be a means for artistic expression and for people to convey who they are and their beliefs and what messages we're trying to send. And yet, if you actually learn how this all works, there is a surprising amount of technicality to it. And so even in writing, which is the field that I'm most passionate about, there is a scary degree of technicality. I can tell what the plot is going to be myself. I can figure, okay, act one ends here, act two starts here. Oh, the character is going to make a selfish choice that gets us into the second part of act two. And so most of what I went through in elementary school and high school were incidental skills that I had learned in order to actually start teaching myself the things I wanted to do. Writing came naturally to me, but there was obviously a lot of help out there to refine my technique. A lot of the performative stuff really just comes from you just have to do it. You have to do it over and over and over again, rack up your 10,000 hours, and then the things that sort of made sense 100 hours in really start to make sense 10,000 hours in. So what I'm interested in hearing on your end is, what was your relationship with education at the time? What were there areas where school was helping you that you can look back on, and were there areas where you felt like your education was holding you back?
Yeah, that's interesting. And you've touched lots of topics here. So let's start with the simplest one. How did I start with self-education? I remember the moment when I actually switched to it. When I was a kid, a radio controlled toy was an expensive and barely available. And I was surrounded with technical magazines where they discuss how to build one by yourself and so on. And I was curious about that. And the very moment when I switched to self-education was when I went to a library and pick a book, How to Beat a Radio-Controlled Model by Yourself. And I started reading it, and I realized that I understand everything, and I'm able to build some electronic devices. A spoiler, I never built any radio controlled toy, but that's not important because after some experiments with electronics, I had no computer and no access to computer. But over time, yes, the parents bought the computer at home, and I found that it is much faster to get the results when you code, because you do some lines of the code and you're able to run it and you get that instant feedback. And actually, fast forward, this is the experimentation mindset, and quick feedback is the core of that learning course, learning approach that I want to promote these days. My mother granted me unlimited budget for books. Again, we had no access to internet because it is the end of 90s, Siberian province. The only source of knowledge was books, and software for coding was also available. That time it was mostly for free illegally in that part of the world where I live. But today, awesome tools, really awesome tools, are free, and the enormous amounts of information are also free and available perfectly legally. And so I started reading books and doing some apps. And then I switched to solving practical tasks. I did something for my mother's work. Then I was doing, I probably cannot recall everything, but something in my university, and so on and so on. You know, actually, that's the most interesting part about education. I also found that I could be more productive very early. So when I was in the last grade of my high school, I did that software for my mother's work, and it it came in place of another project in the university that a group of adult men were actually building. So it worked easier and faster. And so I discovered that I have some natural talents in that area. And also, I found that I'm able to disassemble some part in the car engine that doesn't work, understand how it works, and fix it, or understand what to fix, mostly intuitively. So for me, when I talk about how easy it is to self-learning techniques, yes, we should know that I have some special wiring in my brain that helps me do it in that area. So recently, I started experimenting with self-education in the areas where I'm not very strong, where I do not have natural talents. That's learning natural languages. You also touched how education is a hot topic right now, right? And we also mentioned that. And that's not surprisingly, because we see how AI is replacing the routine operations. And this basically means the value of human is not in the repeating the same operation, but in creating something new. But in order to create something new, you need to learn the tools, learn what other people did before you, and sometimes learn to use the AI properly. So yes, apparently our world has realized that education is important, and the topic is hot. And many people try to implement the education process in a traditional way, when they teach you first something, and then you're supposed to pass some test works and then work and apply that knowledge. But the reverse approach in education is also known, It is not a know-how of a small group of people. The group is large, but it is not very popular and it is not known to all. So, for example, in the school where I'm a mentor, that's the school is not created by me. The learning process is organized in the following way. You get a task and you got no guidance. You have to Google all the answers by yourself to solve that task. Of course, that task is simple. Of course, you can ask your mentor if you have no idea why you stuck with this task. But in most cases, students do that. And only after you come with results, you get the feedback, what you did wrong, because you probably didn't notice some details. You should assume some elements of the good software that is not listed in the requirements explicitly. You should use your common sense or industry standards. And your mentor get your feedback after you did something by yourself. That's evolution. Probably I unintentionally changed the topic, but that correlates. That is how I mostly worked in the past, because I mentioned that everything started with books. Yes, that's a traditional way when you first read and then you do something. But I didn't mention that I did lots of experimenting and lots of studying of other people's code without explanation of why they do that, why they did the code exactly as they did. And I drawn my own conclusions out of what I see. And that way I build up my competency.
Well, just because you said that the subject had gone to a few different places as a result of your answer, that's sort of my job. In the end of the day, is to allow the thinking process to occur, and I'm just a guide, right? But there were a couple of things that struck me as interesting that I wanted to follow up on, and I'm just mindful of the time. I don't want to spend all day on just like what's wrong with the education system. That wasn't the plan. But one thing that I find, I would say, concerning about the nature of completing a task and getting a grade on it is that the incentive is to try to get as high a mark as possible and maybe not necessarily learn the lessons. Whereas what you're discussing with the students that are being mentored and are given these tasks that they have to solve on their own, I'm drawn to the idea of trying to complete it as best as they can, submitting the results and learning through it. And being graded on it might not be the most important part, because the most important part is whether or not you had a true organic takeaway from it. So is there a way that the students are incentivized to just focus on the learning and not so much worry about whether or not they got the 100%, the 99% score at the end of the assignment?
The most efficient training, if it is when you solve the actual task, when you work. So basically you have no grade for that. You do something wrong, it fails in production or in testing. When people use it, they see some bugs and you fix those bugs and you gain your experience, and that way is the most efficient. But still, why do we have some education detached from that process? Because someone should let you in to give you that permission to create bugs in the real app. So we have educational process. And of course, if the educational process is targeted on some grades, this could be a problem, because students tend to focus on, tend to identify these intuitive things to get those grades. So personally, I now in that course of Fox-Minded that I mentioned, I practice discrete estimation. The student is either passed to the next assignment or not. And if the student has not passed, the next assignment is locked, then I provide the feedback not as a number, not as something aggregated, but as a detailed, distinctive clarification of what exactly is wrong, what's unacceptable, what's merely suggestible, so what is cool and what is must have. That's the evolution of education that everyone should consider. We start with traditional learning in school. Maybe school will also evolve and they they are trying some new techs, but so far they're mostly traditional. Then you eventually you will land to a job and you should learn there. And in between, that's your choice, and that's where I promote to choose the methods that engage you to real work. So one thing that I strongly believe that I mentioned is that practice first. You first do something by yourself, and only then you get the guidance. You get theory explaining of what you did. And another thing is that what you did, your assignments, must be realistic. They should be the real projects, maybe without a real consumer, but they should be a copy of a real project. So you get the natural experience. And perfectly, your mentor should be a practicing expert, because you get into that very atmosphere that you will find on your further job. And even when you land the job, the big mistake is to do exactly what you're paid for. Because if you will think, how can I help my boss do his work better? How can I help people from other departments do their work better? How can I help my peers do their work better? You learn, especially when you're trying to help someone who is more qualified than you, whose position assumes higher qualification. You get that experience because you're effectively learning all the things that you cannot be assigned on your position. That's a life hack.
One of my friends who is in IT, I have a couple of friends in IT, and he became quite fascinated and passionate about automation. And what he was telling me after a few weeks of experimenting with automations at work is that his other coworkers were actually getting frustrated with him because what they saw was work that they had spent a long time doing was now being cut down to lesser and lesser hours. And he was confused by this. He couldn't understand why people were getting upset by this. I knew what was going on. It's that not everybody has the inclination to continue to learn and to teach. A lot of people actually just prefer to do their assignment because there's this compartmentalization where what you do in your work is just to get the money and then off we go, and there's not this continuation of the personal journey. So I wonder if you've what's been like the positive and the negative feedback that you've gotten taking this approach to the work environment. Have people sort of resisted the way of getting involved in other people's departments and trying to align the company more to an efficient workflow?
The approach itself is not a problem. The problem is how not how you approach tasks and the problems of your company, but how you approach people. So, of course, if you destroy someone's work by your work, you should realize that you are fighting with that person, and you should understand, do you actually need that? In most cases, not. You need good relations because there are lots of tasks and you could do something different. Again, in most cases, when you help someone, you are not destroying their work. You're augmenting their work. For example, if you're a programmer and you help the customer support, very likely you will eliminate some nagging part of their work, and they will be happy. They will be very thankful to you, not only as a worker, but in a personal sense. But sometimes, theoretically, you could face some challenges that could bring your company to the next level. In this case, maybe the direct opposition to some people in your company is valuable. But that's kind of off topic. The major point here is that when you do whatever you do, you build the connections with people, and these relations are the frame for what I do otherwise. So the tools that you introduce to a company should be meaningful. So they should solve the problems of the company and of other people working in this company. Because Often, if you see some contradiction between the goals of the company and the goals of other people, that's an illusion, because you have some mental model of your company and you see that opportunity in your mind. But in reality, the company is all the people, and it would work a little bit different than you think. So yeah, you could try something new, but the basic frame is the relations with other people. Don't be disruptive unless you innovate.
I think the safest approach would be is to keep an ear out for what are the problems that people are facing, and what are their complaints, and what are their grievances. And that creates the want and the pain point that you can then use as an inspiration to solve it. So it's good to be proactive, but it's a precious resource. And so it's important to use that for when it makes sense, and not when there's going to be a cost-benefit analysis to it. Now, what I wanted to do was start narrowing into our discussion of self-learning. And one of the things that stuck out to me is that you had said that this self-learning and the way that your brain was wired, this was all coming to you naturally. But I understand that you wanted to test this a little bit by trying to self-teach in areas that were not your typical realm of experience. You've been largely in the coding and the programming space. So where else did you try to apply your self-learning techniques, and what were your results?
Great. Let's return to this idea that you already mentioned today, 10,000 hours, right? So what's in it? Because in some areas, every turn for us is intuitive. We call it talent. But the very task that talented people solve is available for other people who are not talented in that very area. It just takes more hours and more work for them. So yes, my track in programming was fast. And today I also see how people often in 3 months get the very basic education, basic skill of software developer to get their first job. And that's a very good target, actually, because you do not know everything that you need in 3 months. But you could learn those things already working on real projects, and you will remember those things much better. And you're very likely able to create value in 3 months after a very basic yet intensive training. And by the way, I'm not talking about talented people here. This target is for everyone. But in a broader perspective, if you don't have a talent in a certain area, but you like this area, and I want to become a professional in that area, this would mean you will need training. Obtaining some patterns of how you act that should become intuitive for you. These patterns are kind of an alphabet of your thought process. And for me, learning foreign languages was most of my life seemed as a mystery. And you could notice in this podcast that my English is still imperfect, and English was the first foreign language that I started to learn, and it took years. It took years for every stage to start reading, to start writing, chatting with other people, and to start speaking with other people. Years between every stage. And when this January, it is October now, I started Portuguese from zero. In 3 months, I found myself able to read in Portuguese. I open a book, and yes, I use vocabulary, but I that's all I need, and I don't translate every word. That goes much faster. And between these two languages, there are other attempts to learn Chinese, Italian, Georgian, where my progress is moderate in comparison to English and Portuguese. But I collected those ideas of how we learn, how should we learn a language. And the perfect example for me is Duolingo in learning languages, the way how they structured, the way you learn the elements, these basic blocks of the language. You do not study the rules. They have the button where you could read theory, and many users do not notice that button, so they simply play in Duolingo by using those patterns. And I found that Duolingo is insufficient for learning language to become fluent in language. But in my opinion, that's only because their base of this pattern is incomplete. I know what to add there to be it more powerful. And otherwise, the very method is very strong, and very likely that method could lead you to be somewhat fluent in language if the base of exercises is big enough. When we talk about software development, I see the same things. People use some patterns. For example, you've got a design of your app made by a designer, and you need to transform into a code, into code that works. So you need some mental patterns, like you see a header, a footer, columns, and your memory should have solutions for those patterns. Or sometimes you change the technology so you don't have the particular solutions, but you still have those patterns, so you could easily Google things because you know what they are, and you could get the instant answers. And these patterns should be developed, should be trained over time, but in the same time, it's mostly different to the natural language. In programming, you don't need them all at once. You could start with a very technical, literal knowledge, some primitive tasks to create value. And that's the thing. To become a good developer, you need to train some things, and it takes years. And that's fine. You should simply accept that. But you could also use some very basic blocks to do something to become a junior developer. And you should go through this different process in the same time. You train things that you cannot understand quickly because they need your brain to rebuild. And you also learn the things that you could start using immediately as soon as you learn them.
You know, one thing that I find ironic about learning languages, well, not that I've done that yet, but once people become so efficient in a language, it actually starts to sound more lazy. That's when slang starts to develop. That's when people start taking verbal shortcuts. And you would think that like the height of perfect English would come naturally to people who are native English speakers, when in reality, the height of like actually the lived English experience is to, well, not always speak eloquently and efficiently. Not that that's a bad thing to do. There are environments where it makes sense to do that, but it is just funny to me personally that a person gets so confident in something that the language itself starts to sound less professional, less pristine, and less eloquent. So there's an irony to that. Now, because programming languages and spoken languages or communication languages are all referred to as languages, I can't help but think that there was some stuff in common in trying to learn both of them. Did you notice any similarities or any techniques that worked in trying to learn a coding language as well as a speaking language?
No, I say that they are somewhat opposite. They are naturally opposite. And let's talk about that a little bit. The natural language is the living thing. It evolves and it lives by its own laws of nature. The programming language is the opposite, is a completely synthetic thing. It has its own author, and that author wanted to make the language simple. We've got Esperanto for natural languages. It has some community of enthusiasts. It was designed to be simple, but it is not very popular, and people study English that is not convenient in many regards. That's the difference. To learn a programming language, if you know one programming language, most of the programming languages fall into the same type of imperative languages. Not important what it means, but if you know one language of that type, you could learn another language of that type in 1 hour. And that's the difference with human language, because programming language is very small. Then on top of the programming language, you have some what's called the library. The library of a language is somewhat like a vocabulary of the natural language, but it's not exactly the same. It is like you imagine a vocabulary plus common collocations plus idioms. Maybe in this set is the same as library. And yes, library could take some more time. This time depends on a person, and some things from the library will need to change the way how you see things, because it contains some inventions by its authors that are not represented in different programming languages. This is a similarity with the grammar of a natural language, but the difference that the natural language is completely consists of this grammar, of these inventions that change the way you think about the world. And in natural languages, you've got lots of false friends. For example, the preposition in and na could be, and na in Russian could be at first sight connected as meaning the same. And this is wrong, because people use in the same situation different preposition, especially when the situation is abstract. Or, for example, in Portuguese, am covers the scope of both in and on in English. And you have to really rebuild the way your brain works. So with natural language, you kind of develop a separate persona for every language. That's the point. So in programming, you learn the patterns like what I mentioned, like the ability to see the elements of a design. That's the thing that you need to train. You cannot actually understand them. You need this pattern to work automatically. The algorithms, some people learn by thick books on algorithms and trying to do that. Those things are very important for a natural language, and you should start with them. And you should, from the beginning, switch to that mode that I'm not learning the explanation, I'm practicing the things. And if I don't understand how they work, but somehow I remember how they work, that's even better if I don't understand the explanation. And in programming, it's different. You start with the very simple things, as I actually mentioned, because they're low-hanging fruit for you. And then in the background to the work, you learn the other things, because you can do your work without those things. Knowing the patterns, algorithms, or having a rich experience in turning designs to HTML will improve your productivity. But basically, you're able to do the work even with the formal knowledge.
That's quite the interesting answer. It's, as I was asking, my idea was, well, surely there's something in common, just because of the fact that both are using the term language, but the idea that one has to be set in stone, because if you veer from it, then the program is going to crash. I mean, people try so hard to make it work, and then next thing you know, it's whatever happened. Whereas going back to what I was saying about the distillation and the slangification of language, is that if I'm trying to communicate with somebody in a certain part of town and I'm using proper speech, I might not get through to this person. So doing it right would actually be doing it wrong. So having to curtail my language in order to be understood by this other person is the actual path to a successful conversation.
That's the way natural languages live, and you should basically accept it. I was wondered that native English speakers sometimes cannot understand other native English speakers from other countries, because for Russian, and I believe the same for Spanish and Portuguese, it is different. You can understand people speaking on those languages from all around the world. That could be related to the traditions of the language, because English uses shorter words. So Russian or Spanish words has more redundancy. And so it is easier to understand it here and there. But at least you should realize that American English, North American English, and British English have the common root only 300 years ago. That's quite a few for a social process. They are remarkably different already. So people continuously change things, and that's a natural process. And you should learn the natural language. For example, in Duolingo, they do not have exercises for Portuguese on how people actually pronounce very common words. Words you and is sound academically, sounds as você and está. And when people pronounce it in the real life, they say only the last syllable, se, ta. And I haven't trained that in Duolingo because there are no exercises with this pronunciation, and I was unable to understand the natural speech on Netflix.
I noticed that happened when I was trying to learn Italian on Duolingo. It didn't come across with the kind of cadence that you expect from an Italian speaker, like si, il, una, ragazza. Like, yeah, it's a starting point, but definitely not the passion that you expect to hear from an Italian speaker.
Yeah, but as I mentioned, I strongly believe that the way they make you train the language is perfect. They just have incomplete base. So in my case, if they would add the same sentences, but with different pronunciation for the same sentence, the academic pronunciation and the natural pronunciation, I would train my neurons to recognize both of them. So if you want to sound professional, you should learn how to sound professional. You should learn different styles. We do that in our mother tongue if we want to write for science, to write in legalese, etc. It is nothing wrong that people change the way how they speak when they learn the language. If the way how they speak eventually is exactly what solves their problem, then it's all right. I've just come with an example, like the full forms of the words in Portuguese, and that's the only form you are taught initially. So when you're a beginner, you speak in those full forms. It's like in English, always speak in full forms, never use those kind of contractions.
So what I wanted to get one thing, as you were developing your programming career on your own, obviously at some point you've been able to find a job. So what did you have in terms of either credentials or experience, or what did you do to really impress the first people that were willing to hire you?
My experience is not relevant to this story because most of developers will go a different way. Some of us, like me, created their portfolio from the high school. So in high school, I made my first website. I made the real web app that was introduced and used in the university. Then I was in my university and I created some more stuff. And after that, I started my own web design agency. So when I came to the first employer, I had a long track, including my own outsourcing business. That's a very different story. But of course, I saw the situation from the opposite side of the table, because I hired some people who were still students. For some, it was their first job. So I saw that from that way. And apparently, today in IT, all the employers expect you to be able to do something from the beginning, to show them some real code that you make. And there is no strict criteria or what it should be. And of course, it should be as practical as possible. So in most cases, if you will come and say that I've been doing some assignments in my university, that wouldn't impress anyone. But even that kind of experience could impress your potential employer. If you are really excited of what you did there, you can dive into details, you can describe what you learned there. And that's the thing. So everyone expects some evidence that you could create things and solve the real tasks. It is for the first position, the ability to solve tasks is even much more important than your awareness of technology, because no one expects you in the beginning is aware of, is experienced in algorithms, in software architecture, etc., because you just haven't yet seen so many things to compare to build your own opinion on that. But your mindset is a real manufacturing tool. If you have mindset for solving tasks, that's the thing that will help you to get your first job. And if you have some evidence that you did that in the past, that's exactly what you basically need. This doesn't mean you will get your first job from the first attempt. You will have to do 100 or more applications. That's fine, but still you need to prepare something to show to your employer, some evidence.
The evidence, and then also the enthusiasm to speak about it, so that you can really take people through the narrative side of it as well.
The artifact that you created something, and the enthusiasm, so people feel that it was really you who did that.
Yeah, it wasn't ChatGPT, which is one thing I'm going to ask you afterwards. But the other one that I wanted to make sure that we cover today. So, do you have an ideal process for the education of a web developer? Is there like a perfect means that, let's just say, for instance, someone is starting from scratch and wanted to take a stab at web development as part of their skill set? Do you see a roadmap for this?
Yeah. This is not a roadmap. This is I see it more as an environment. Because what's the problem with roadmaps is that sequence. And in particular, that's one of the problems of Duolingo. It should rather be an environment when you could proceed in various tracks to achieve the same goal, and where you could specialize in some aspects on the goal, because you cannot choose your education, your specialization before you start learning, because you are not aware of the things, and it should be there. So the perfect place to learn I see as a combination of the following activities. There should be some training area that I see as Duolingo for web developers, but it won't look the same as Duolingo. The only similarity is that you solve tiny tasks, and that way you generate your confidence. Then it should be mentoring, like what I've described for Fox-Minded, where you get a vague task, you should find all the answers yourself, and you should get the feedback. And eventually, all of that should be integrated into a project where people collaborate and create a real app. One step back, when that process where you have a review from a mentor could and should be augmented by peer review, because when you get a review from your peers, and when you do that kind of review, you understand what you do much better, because I see that students often miss some topics. For example, you give them an assignment, set up automatic code style in your project, code style tracking, code style checks. They do that, and in the next assignment, you see that things is lost. So they got that feedback from their mentor that, hey, you lost what you did previously, but it asked you to use this over again all through your career. And it would be much better to get this feedback from a peer, or to be that peer who says, hey, that's important, use that. And eventually get all those people into a project where they could differentiate with their specialization. Some could switch to UX, front end, back end, full stack, testing. There are lots of things, and the good qualification should actually include all of them. So you are strong in something like front-end development, but you definitely need some awareness, and even better, some practical experience in all the other test areas. Maybe you won't be the really good UX designer, but you should be at least some kind of UX designer to properly collaborate with the real UX designer team. So during the education, you could try the things. Let's wrap up. That's the environment. That's not a track. In the environment, we have a network of the different skills and lessons. Everybody builds their own track. Of course, you have some basic guides for that. It shouldn't be puzzling. Then what we actually really need there, code reviews by peers and by mentors, and in the end to get a real project.
I, for one, can see quite a bit of value if I even had the opportunity to, let's just say I'm in a group of 30 people and we all try to solve the same problem and come up with 30 different ways to do it. Just being able to see how everybody else solved their problem, I think would be an immense resource of information. I think picking up on things that I didn't pick up on, and likewise how I would have done it, could be valuable to other people as well. So I think that's one part of the education process that I would value immensely if I were to take a stab at it myself, going back. And we did a little bit of programming in school. I survived on just if statements. Everything for me was just if this, then that. That was everything that I did in programming was just if statements. So definitely a long road for me to, if I were to go forward with this. But one last question that I wanted to ask you, and this is for fun, but it does have some pretty serious implications. So as we mentioned a couple of times, AI is not only unavoidable, it is the future. And I, for one, I'm a proponent of it. I use it to help me creatively. I use it to help me with image generation. So I'm on board with it. What I'd like to hear from you is, what do you see AI as having the biggest impact in terms of education? Do you think it could even go as far as render the school system obsolete and force it to undergo a change? I don't think learning will ever go away. We're always going to need to learn, but I'm really curious to know what you think is going to happen to education in the next 10 or so years.
Yeah, that's a huge impact on both the way how we create the code or apps, because apps, it not only code, but also images and texts. And it also affects the way how we could learn. The impact on learning is enormous. So let's start with a simpler thing. Using AI to create anything, any code. When you're an experienced programmer or when you're only a beginner, it is something good. Because in the end, we need the solutions that are good. And by good, I mean that they work and they are reliable and extendable. So they could evolve. It is not a one-time story. So if you can do that by copying other people's code, that's good. You should only guarantee that it works and that it has decent quality. If you can use it by ready-made components with no code available, that's also good. If you could generate that code with AI, that's good. If you found what to take using AI, that's also good. But this doesn't mean that we do not need to learn anymore. It's the opposite. We should learn more and more, because when AI comes with some answer, you should validate this answer. And even if you get some program and you are able to run that program, this doesn't necessarily mean that the seasoned developer on review will accept it, because it can contain lots of problems that are not obvious to you, and you should build your learning process somehow to learn those things. In the course I'm drafting right now, I engage people to start using ChatGPT from the very beginning. And the whole lesson is based on experimentation. So you start not by writing the code, you start by playing with the code written by others. And you use ChatGPT for two things. First, to explain you the new elements that you see after the moment when you've learned the whole structure and you're able to say that this is a tag and this is an attribute, you're able to form your question to ChatGPT and ask, what is it? I see a new tag. What could be the tag section? What does it mean? And you will get quick answer much faster than in Google. Before ChatGPT, it also worked, but you need to Google that. So there are alternatives here. But you could also ask ChatGPT to come up with a solution for a certain problem. For example, you got an assignment to make a text underline. Assignment in that style that I like, that no one teaches you how to do that. You go to ChatGPT and you ask it how to do that. And if you're able to take that answer and use it, then your learning is progressing successfully. Plus, AI could do lots of other things, but that for another podcast. For example, in review, when I mentioned mentor review and peer review, AI also could do reviews, and it does it like a skilled developer.
Well, I think of all the things that you said, what sticks out to me the most as exciting, a little scary, but mostly exciting, is that we're not going to reduce learning. This is going to exponentially increase learning. And it's going to give people so much more opportunity to really get ahead and get as far as people envision. So for me, that's quite the place to end it. Once again, my name is Joseph. And if you need help in any way on the web media, you can find me, Joseph Ianni, on LinkedIn. Look for this handsome face. I just with a shave. I tend to shave. Pavel, if there's anything you want to let the audience know in terms of finding you, contacting you, reaching out, let the audience know. Otherwise, I think we're done for today.
Yeah, thanks to everyone who've been with us. You can find me on social media in Twitter. The name is Pavel, KRGN.